The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. In 2004, over the objection of many Bronx advocates, the city signed a memorandum of understanding that assigned more than $200 million of funding to improve Bronx parks as mitigation compensation for the use of Van Cortlandt Park to build the Croton water filtration plant. The agreement called for the money to be spent on improving Bronx parks within 5 years, meaning that by 2009, the money should have been spent and the parks improved. But it's recently come to light that all the money might not have been spent in the required time, and as a result, the promises that were made in the heat of a controversial agreement were false ones. Tonight we do two things. We've gotten a hold of exclusive video of Mayor Bloomberg making those promises directly in a Bronx park, of all places. And also we have an expert in our studio to help us analyze the very complex system of funding that has, or has not, brought the Bronx the parks funding that it was promised. Phones are open tonight, so please feel free to call in if you'd like. You can call 718-960-7241. You can also email comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Also, you can make comments on our new Facebook page, Bronx Talk on Facebook. But for now, please join me in welcoming the supervising analyst from the New York City Independent Budget Office, known as the IBO, Anna Champagny. Good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So before we break it down, what in general has gone on here? What is the process that either has or has not happened?
Well, the city was required by the federal government to start filtering the water that comes to the city from the Croton watershed. It provides about 10% of the city's water. And they considered a few sites. One of them was Van Cortlandt Park. One was a site along the Harlem River, and another was a site up in Westchester. And after extensive review, they decided that the site in Van Cortlandt Park would be the most cost-effective. And after that, there was a negotiation to provide some mitigation, as you said, to Bronx residents for the use of the parkland. And that was to be $200 million.
Is this a common sort of agreement? I mean, there's all kinds of projects going on. I know in the Bronx, and I was part of a lengthy dialogue at the outset, literally now many years ago, about where it should be built and what the terms of an agreement might be. It struck us at that time as being rather unusual. Is this a common thing? Does the city sign these kinds of memorandum of understandings for fundings or for other kinds of mitigation to help communities when they do something that may not be as palatable to the people in the community?
I'm not familiar with many examples offhand. When the city did build Yankee Stadium, there was a similar issue where parkland that the city owned was being used for the stadium, and there was an agreement there to provide certain amenities. So under state law, if you want to reuse parkland for something else or demap it from parkland, you have to compensate the community. So in that circumstance,
that might have happened. Of course, many people believe that the filtration plant was the precursor for the agreement on Yankee Stadium, that you wouldn't have had one without the other. And so if you say those are the two glaring examples, I think for the historical purposes that might have been true. And we are going to break it down, and I am going to show you that exclusive video. Before we get into it, do you want to make a statement? Do you have a sense that all the money has been spent within the 5 years, or it has not been spent, or should we go down and break it down before I ask you that question?
All of the money has not been spent yet. There was about 2/3 of it was spent within the first 5 years. Some more has been spent since then. And according to the city's capital plans, they are intending to spend the full $200 million.
To make that commitment.
Yeah, it will probably not be done for another at least couple years. There's still $45 million to be spent.
So 219, I think, was the specific number, and then minus 45 million. That is how much you think has been spent at this point?
The MOU specifically says that the city will spend $200 million, but it lists $219 million of eligible projects. We've always used the $200 million figure as the amount that the city was supposed to put towards these parks. Out of that, $45 million has not been spent yet.
So, just in terms of an agreement, I know you're not a lawyer, but and you can, and I also know that you represent the IBO, so I don't know if it's an area that you want to get into. But the terms were for 5 years, and the idea was so that people wouldn't say, "Well, they'll spend it, to eternity." If they didn't spend that money, if they are 1/3 short, as you say, for maybe $45 million short. That would suggest that they simply broke the agreement. They didn't spend the amount of money in the amount of time that they had promised, and I have a copy of that memorandum in front of me.
I mean, I'm not, as you say, a lawyer, and an MOU, in my understanding, isn't quite as binding as state legislation or other circumstances. But
in
you're right.
layman's terms, it would appear that. I'll say it. You don't have to say it. Okay. Fair enough. All right, what I want to do, we received this video from a guy named Mike Callender, who many people know in the Bronx. He's out shooting video and photography and everything else. And he mentioned to me once that he had a copy of the actual video of Mayor Bloomberg coming to the Bronx after the MOU was signed to talk about the promises that were to be made or that were being made for Bronx funding. This is an exclusive moment. Nobody else has ever seen this video, certainly since the time that it was shot in, I think, the spring of 2003. So let's take a look at the first clip. This is Mayor Bloomberg at St. James Park, surrounded by many Bronx elected officials, making a promise to provide the aforementioned funding for Bronx Parkland in exchange for the building of the Croton filtration plant. Let's take a look.
Now, the city and state governments have reached an agreement that allows the city to build this much-needed filtration plant. The city council took the final decisive step on Tuesday when it voted to approve construction of the plant. That vote cleared the way for the creation over the next 5 years of an unprecedented $219 million green legacy here in the Bronx. That is a level of investment in parks that has not been seen in the Bronx or in any other borough, for that matter, since the days of the WPA, when the entire park system was rebuilt and it tripled in size. So this really does represent an historic commitment to improving the urban environment. The funds for these projects will come from the bills New Yorkers pay for water service. So the investment in parks in the Bronx that I am describing does not in any way reduce what the City Department of Parks and Recreation plans to spend on capital projects in the Bronx, which this year is $44 million. In fact, it more than triples the city's commitment to the parks in this borough over the next 5 years.
Okay, so there you have it. The mayor said the $219 million over 5 years. That has not happened. People can interpret that any way they want. Do you have a sense of, and again, I don't know if this is within your purview, did we create the green legacy that he says that he's going to do? Is that, do you have a sense of, whether or not this has really done what he contends at that time that it was going to do?
I mean, the city has spent close to $165 million on parks in the Bronx since the start of the plan.
So it'll be up to somebody else to interpret whether it's a legacy or not.
Yes.
Is this an historic investment in parks, as he said? Is this kind of thing on record anywhere else? Do we spend this kind of funding on other projects or anything like that?
I mean, what we can do is we can look at what the city has been spending for the, since about 2000, and I think there's been a very significant commitment to parks citywide. between 2005 and 2011, the city was spending somewhere in the area of $2.5 to $3 billion on parks citywide. So some of that was in the Bronx, but a fair amount of that was in other parts of the city. So I think as a whole, the city has put a lot of money towards parks in this time period.
Mm-hmm. The other question, which I think does fall right within, and we have some charts. You brought a couple of things that we're going to take a look at. She was explaining to me so I could understand them a little better, is the idea that because many advocates were concerned that, well, so they'll spend $200 million here, but they'll take it off what they spend on parks anyway. The mayor clearly said that we would not take it away. That $200 million would be in addition to the capital funding of parks. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say now whether you think that had been done? Did they keep their capital funding steady, or did that also change or maybe drop over the years?
I think that's a difficult question, partly because you have to consider about what is the right thing to count. It's also difficult because we don't really know what would have been spent in the Bronx in the absence of the Croton money.
Agreement. And he said it would be $44 million.
Well, I believe he said it was $44 million that year. I don't know what the city would have spent. They weren't averaging $44 million a year prior to the agreement. It was closer to about $30 million a year. If you look at the 5 years, the amount spent in the Bronx does increase, but the thing to keep in mind is that there was significant money spent on Yankee Stadium infrastructure and replacement parks for Yankee Stadium at the same time.
I want to show a chart that you brought, and that really highlights this question, which has come up behind the scenes as to whether, if you're counting the monies, whether or not Yankee Stadium should be included, or was that really a separate project. I did note, and I was reviewing the original list, and we were just talking about it previously, that for Mullally and McCombs Dam Park, there was a total of $7.5 million promised out of the Croton funds. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so we've got this chart up. Explain to me what it is that people are looking at here. There basically are two columns there.
So the column on the left-hand side is the average that the Parks Department spent in a year from 2000 to 2004. This is sort of the pre-Croton benchmark that we have.
Okay.
The second bar...
And that amount, it looks like it's falling right between 20 and 40, and that's why you had said it was $30 million.
This is about 30. On the right-hand side, and in this case, we didn't focus in on the first 5 years because they're continuing to spend the funds to reach the $200 million. We've looked at what they've spent through the end of last fiscal year. So looking at the 7 years from 2005 to 2011, the average spent overall was about $80 million a year. But you can see that the bar is broken up into three pieces. So the bottom piece is the standard Parks Department projects. It's comparable to what was on the in the other bar.
Okay, so basically in between 2005 and 2011, they spent $37 million. Again, never reaching the $44 million that the mayor said, but slightly larger than they had spent on capital projects anyway. Right. And a question that people could ask is, did that extra $7 million, is that part of the Croton parks or not, or did that come out of some other pile of money?
No, the bottom three pieces of the chart don't include the Croton money. That's sort of the green piece on top. The $37 million is just standard city-funded capital.
Okay.
That might be part of the difference. This is only city funds, so if there were some federal or state monies coming to the Parks Department, we're not counting those here.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have money that was spent on the replacement parks for Yankee Stadium. So this is specifically parkland in the Bronx that residents have access to, and that raises the annual spending to about $63 million. So it's higher than it had been, and the relative share of Bronx money to the rest of the city is about the same in the 2005 to 11 period as it is to the 2000.
In other words, they spent X amount of money on parks in the Bronx during that period, and you're saying on an average that is comparable to what they spent later on. Even with, one would think that it would be higher because they spent an extra, they were ostensibly supposed to spend an extra $200 million. So if the amount was the same, they never really, it appears, increased the amount that they spent in the Bronx over this period after the Croton projects were built.
But this isn't counting any of the money for Croton. This is just at what was in the Parks Department.
Okay.
I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
Okay. It could be that I misunderstood.
Part of what happened is that in this period, the city spent more money on parks in general. So the reason why $67 million is the same share of spending as it was in the pre-Croton era is that there's just this general increase. So what I'm trying to say is that relative to the rest of the city, the part of the pot that the Bronx was getting from 2005 to 2011 was similar to what it had been getting before, not counting the Croton money.
Not counting the Croton parks.
The Croton money gives you, based on what they've actually spent so far, about another $20 million a year.
Did they spend more on the Yankee Stadium replacement parks than was listed for the $7.5 million from Mullally and McCombs Dam Park?
The Yankee Stadium replacement parks come in at about $174 million.
$174 million. So there's no way that could be coming out of the Croton money, right? Well,
no, that did not come out of the Croton money.
So then why would some people say that the Yankee Stadium should be counted as part of the expenditure for the Croton money?
It's not that it should be counted as part of the expenditure for the Croton. It's that it should be counted as part of the city's investment in parks in terms of its maintenance of effort, we might say, in demonstrating that they continue to provide city funding for parks in addition to the money that Croton was providing, so that additional $20 million.
Right. Let's go to Mark from Pelham Parkway, who has been with us every time we've talked about this and many other city topics. What are your thoughts, Mark?
I don't know. Well, I'm going to say this, Gary. I came in about 5 minutes later of your show, but all I know is that when they built the, and I was one of the people who protested against them putting the filtration plant there, which has escalated $1.2 billion to $4 billion, and it keeps on growing, and it's going to end up flooding. We were supposed to get $240 to $250 million for the parks. It hasn't materialized. I'm sure it's just like, and somehow with creative bookkeeping that the city does, I'm sure we're going to get the good old shaft. It's like when you do, I'm in the film industry, it's like when you do a movie and they go the difference between gross and net. How you make a movie for $25 million, the movie makes $400 million, but still it's not in profit.
So your point is, you're just saying this, from your perspective, is the way things go and things have gone in the
Yeah, I mean, look what's happened with the Yankee Stadium parks. The people, the very parks that they took away, half the people won't be able to use those parks. They're leasing them out. I was by 161st Street today. I saw that beautiful park with the nice baseball field, but that's the field where the regular people can't use. They're leasing it out to the corporate. What if they built with the promises from 2-3 years ago to have parks going?
Right. It also took a little while longer. Mark, thank you. It also took a little while longer to build those parks. So not a question for Anna, but it really is, from Mark's perspective, broken promises. Bob from Riverdale has also been with us a number of times when we've talked about this. How are you, Bob?
Okay, good evening, Gary.
Hi.
In my column in the Bronx News last week, I wrote about Commissioner Aponte's presentation at the BronxTalk Speak Out.
Right.
And only 37 projects are done in how many years?
Well, it's now more than 5 years. Let's say from 2004, so now we're talking about, 7-8 years.
Right. 8 are in the construction phase and 17 are still in the design phase? This is actually the core of what we're talking about. My contention or suggestion has been that they didn't spend, and we've got video to show what the promises were, but it didn't actually happen. It sounds like typical Bloomberg. Promises, never kept.
All right.
Also, Gary, we need to look at Van Cortlandt Park where the plant is. And the stadium is falling apart. The fields can't be used. There are plenty of projects in Van Cortlandt Park.
That was for the other show we did with the Parks Advocate, and we were talking about all the different projects and the conditions of it. We know that Harris Field is still unusable and the parade grounds. We know all that. Bob, thank you very much. Anna, let's do this. Let's take a look at the second clip off that Bronx Media piece of footage, again, exclusive for BronxTalk, the actual promises made under the Croton Filtration Agreement. So let's watch the second clip here.
Available. The city needed state legislative approval to use parkland for this project. The legislation stipulated that there be a, quote, memorandum of understanding, unquote, among the Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver and Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno, detailing the city's commitment to making at least $200 million in improvements to parks and open spaces in the Bronx. To provide substance to that commitment, the Department of Parks and Recreation did years of outreach and consultation, taking suggestions and ideas from Bronx elected officials and community boards. They held dozens of meetings with a wide range of community organizations. Governor Pataki, whose commitment to creating parks for New Yorkers and recreational opportunities for our youth is one of his greatest achievements, made sure that the improvements to Roberto Clemente Park got included. The result of all this was that a list of more than 60 projects in every part of this borough was created. Work on the first of them will begin next spring. They fall into...
This is Bob's question, because Bob said, well, only 37 projects, and he said there would be 60 within 5 years, and certainly it didn't happen. In a perfect world, right, in the way that this should be done, the way that it seems to me, is if you make this promise and you want to back it up, you allocate the money that you're supposed to have, you either put it aside or account for it, and then it comes from the water money, so then the parks gets it, and then the parks implement it. Is that how the money goes, and is that what should have happened in this particular case?
Well, yes, the funding should have been made available to the Parks Department to put into the city's capital plan. Because capital projects are financed through borrowing, it's not that the city would have gone out and put $200 million into an account, but they did make those funds available for the Parks Department to schedule projects within the capital plan, and the full 200 is still in there. As I've said, they are planning to spend the rest of that money, and it's clearly DEP funding that the Parks Department is spending.
So from the way you see it, and I think we should be clear, because it seems like the agencies didn't get together. From your perspective, the DEP actually did make the funding available, but it's the Parks Department, for whatever reason, has not actually implemented the plan and put it together.
That has been my understanding.
No, they had talked about, the mayor went on in that piece to break it down into 5 categories: neighborhood parks, regional recreational facilities, connecting the Bronx, he called it waterfront access, and greening the Bronx. Do you have a sense that he's actually, spread the money out as they had said they would, or is there kind of things skeined one way or the other? I mean, do you have a sense of, what might have been spent out of this, and what was the favorite and what wasn't?
Well, the roughly 60 projects that are listed in the MOU as eligible are, in fact, categorized in these groups, and so it is possible to see. One thing to note is some of those projects aren't being done anymore, like the McCombs Dam, for example, and there are new projects that have been added. So I can't quite categorize the new ones. But looking at sort of what was in the plan and what's been spent, neighborhood parks and playgrounds, for example, so far they've spent the most of that. The plan called for $50 million, and they've spent about $45 so far, and they're planning to spend another $3. And so that seems to be a place where they've made progress. All of the projects are either complete or in construction. The other areas, the percentages are closer to 70-75% of the money that was listed is what's planning to be spent, and then, as I said, there's that extra $30 million, so roughly $30 million that I can't quite put into the categories.
So basically, this list, which is the original list, it wasn't held tried and true. In other words, they either interpreted it or decided something was not doable for any number of reasons, or didn't simply do it. I guess it goes back to your original statement. It's not really legally enforceable. What's the worth of the paper it's written on if, in fact, the city and various officials, even though the thing was signed by, Shelley Silver and Joe Bruno and the mayor, but that, we can interpret it and change it.
I mean, what the MOU says is that the city will spend $200 million, $190 on parks improvements, $10 million on greening the Bronx, and that they will pick from these eligible projects.
I understand the guy, my friend Mike Callender, who shot the video, called in. So, Mike, you were there that day. Do you have any thoughts, or what do you want to share with us now before we run out of time?
Well, the first thing, hello, greetings, thank you. And first thing I want to say is it's so important that people understand the depth of what's going on here, because the Bronx has been put to the side so often that whenever people say there's going to be money allocated or jobs created, here in the Bronx, we have a lot of positive things happening, and we don't want the outside world or even Queens or Brooklyn to think that, hey, all right, the Bronx is still that negative place where you can come in, you can say, hey, I'm going to throw a little bit of money here and clean this up.
Mike, we're almost out of time.
Happens.
So your suggestion here is that that's what happened here, is that, you know what, we can make a promise and maybe not keep it up. I mean, that's
right.
What you're saying.
Yeah. Bottom line, there's been plenty of promises made for the Bronx, and if you look at like what you're doing now, and there's a whole lot of other footage and other promises that was made that, if you look at the Bronx condition currently, a lot of them have not been fulfilled.
Right. Mike, thank you for the use of the video and making it available to us. We appreciate that. Anna, just to conclude, in the future, are there ways to make this so if there are promises of funding or jobs, are there ways to do it so it is legally enforceable, or is this really the best you've got when you've got politicians talking?
I mean, I would think that doing it through legislation might be more binding than doing a memorandum of understanding outside of the legislative process. But other than that,
you don't know. Listen, I know that your purview is really the budgeting, and we appreciated you making the presentation and at least confirming some of the numbers for us. And interpretation we'll leave to our viewers and some of our callers and everybody else. We do appreciate your time. We appreciate the work of the Independent Budget Office, and of course for you joining us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Folks, if you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at bronxnet.org. You click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar, and please like our Bronx Talk Facebook page. We'd love to have you. Bronx Talk every Monday nights at 9 here at BronxNet's Cablevision Channel 67, Verizon Fios 33. Thanks to producer Jane Folloro, director Michael Arias, and to Dina, who did a great job getting all the materials together for us tonight. To the cast of thousands here, and to you, good night, and happy birthday to Jane. Her birthday is tomorrow.
That's slow. That's slow. That's slow. Seriously.